The fire had gone out 3 hours before dawn, and Ingrid Halvorsen knew she might not survive until sunrise. Outside her Minnesota cabin, the blizzard that had raged for 3 days showed no sign of stopping, and her woodpile lay buried somewhere beneath 6 feet of snow she could not reach. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's tale is even more remarkable than this one. The cold crept through the cabin walls like water seeping through cloth. Ingrid pulled both quilts around her shoulders and watched her breath form clouds in the darkness. The iron stove in the corner held nothing but ash and a few glowing embers that would die within the hour. She had burned the last piece of dry wood at midnight. That was when she still believed the storm would break by morning. It was January of 1882. Ingrid was 34 years old and had been living alone on the homestead claim. For 8 months, ever since Eric died, the cabin sat on 160 acres of mixed forest and meadowland in central Minnesota, 3 miles from the nearest neighbor. Eric had built it the year they arrived, using the same methods every other settler used. Logs notched at the corners, mud chinked between gaps, a simple door, 2 small windows, and a wood shingle roof. It kept out rain and most of the wind. That had seemed sufficient. The woodpile stood 20 feet from the cabin door. Eric had always kept it well stocked, split wood stacked in neat rows under the slight overhang of the roof's edge. After he died, Ingrid had maintained the system. She split wood every few days, kept the pile organized, made sure she had fuel ready. The arrangement had worked fine through autumn and early winter. Then the blizzard arrived on January 9th. The first day brought heavy snow and high winds. Ingrid had made several trips to the woodpile, each time fighting through deepening drifts, to retrieve armloads of wood. By evening, the snow was waist-deep and still falling. She had brought in enough wood to last through the night, or so she thought. The second day, she could barely open the door against the snow that had drifted against it. She managed to force it open wide enough to squeeze through and fought her way to where the woodpile should have been. She found nothing but a uniform slope of white. The wind had created a drift that completely buried the stacked wood. She dug with her hands until they went numb, finding only frozen chunks of snow that might have been wood underneath, but might have been anything. After 20 minutes outside, she retreated to the cabin before frostbite could set in. She had burned her indoor supply carefully, rationing pieces to make them last. But wood burns at a fixed rate regardless of how carefully you feed it to flames. By the third day she was burning furniture. A chair went into the stove piece by piece. Then part of a small shelf. The wood was dry and burned hot, but there was not much of it. By midnight on the third day, she had nothing left to burn except the walls themselves. Eric Halvorsen had died on May 23, 1881. Crushed beneath a falling oak tree he was clearing for pasture land. The tree had caught on another during its fall, hung suspended for a moment, then dropped without warning, while Eric stood beneath it calculating which direction to pull. He died instantly. 3 neighbors helped Ingrid bury him on a rise overlooking the creek that ran through their property. The funeral was small. Pastor Lindgren from the Swedish Lutheran church in town spoke words Ingrid barely heard. Her son Anders stood beside her, 13 years old, and silent. Her daughter Karen, 11, cried into Ingrid's skirt. The neighbors, 5 families in total, brought food and offered condolences. Several of the men suggested Ingrid sell the claim and move back to family in Iowa, where her sister lived. Ingrid had thanked them politely and declined. The homestead was hers under the law. Eric had filed the claim in 1879, and they had lived on the land for 2 years, meeting the residency requirement. He had died 3 years short of proving up the full 5-year term that would grant them ownership. If Ingrid left now, they would forfeit everything Eric had worked for. She would stay and complete the claim period herself. The neighbors had exchanged glances but said nothing more. A widow completing a homestead claim alone was unusual but not impossible. Ingrid was strong and capable. She knew how to work. but there were doubts unspoken in their expressions. Could she manage the heavy labor? Would she survive winters without a man to cut firewood and make repairs? The summer of 1881 passed in exhausting routine. Ingrid tended the garden Eric had planted before he died. She harvested vegetables, preserved what she could in the root cellar, and traded surplus for supplies in town. Anders helped with the heavier work, but he was still a boy and lacked his father's strength. Together, they cut hay for the 2 cows and the horse. They repaired fence rails that had rotted through. They split firewood whenever time allowed. By autumn, Ingrid had established a working rhythm. She rose before dawn, managed the livestock, prepared meals, maintained the cabin, and fell asleep each night too tired to think about anything beyond the next day's tasks. It was survival, not prosperity, but it was enough. The first winter alone had been difficult but manageable. The woodpile Eric had prepared the previous year lasted through February. Snow came and went in typical patterns, nothing extreme. Ingrid and the children stayed warm and adequately fed. By spring, she felt confident they could continue. The homestead would be theirs in 3 more years. They simply had to endure. Then came the second winter, and the blizzard that buried the woodpile and left Ingrid shivering in darkness, understanding for the first time that endurance might not be enough. The nearest family was the Johnsons, Norwegians, who had claimed land 2 miles south. Carl Johnson was a blacksmith by trade, and farmed because homestead law required it. His wife Helga baked bread that she sometimes shared with Ingrid, delivered by their oldest daughter on Sunday afternoons. The Johnsons thought Ingrid was foolishly stubborn for staying on the claim alone, though they never said so directly to her face. 3 miles east lived the Bergstroms, a Swedish couple with 6 children ranging from 17 down to 3 years old. Lars Bergstrom was methodical and serious, a man who planned everything seasons in advance. His wife Astrid had helped Ingrid during the worst days after Eric's death, sitting with her while she cried and making sure the children were fed. Astrid worried privately that Ingrid would work herself to death trying to prove she could manage alone. To the north across the creek, a Finnish family named Makinen had settled on 80 acres of heavily forested land. They spoke little English and kept mostly to themselves, but they were competent woodsmen who supplied split firewood to families willing to trade goods for it. Ingrid had traded preserved vegetables for firewood twice during her first winter alone. The Makinens thought her capable, but observed that capability only carried a person so far when circumstances turned against them. South and west lived 2 more families, the O'Driscolls and the Schneiders, Irish and German respectively. Both had been in the area longer than most, having arrived in the early 1870s. They had proven up their claims and now owned their land outright. They were established, stable, and faintly condescending toward newer settlers still struggling through their claim periods. These families formed the social fabric of Ingrid's world. They gathered for occasional barn raisings, harvest help, and church services when weather permitted travel to town. They shared news, traded labor, and maintained the informal support networks that frontier life required. But they also judged each other constantly, measuring competence and viability with the cold arithmetic of survival. When Ingrid emerged from her cabin 3 days after the blizzard ended, half frozen and having barely survived burning furniture to stay alive, several neighbors came to check on her. They helped dig out her woodpile and restocked her cabin with fuel. They brought food and made sure she and the children were recovering. They were kind and helpful because that was expected, but they also talked among themselves. Ingrid heard fragments of their conversations, words carried on wind or overheard at the general store. "She's not going to make it. A woman alone can't handle the heavy work. She should sell while she still can. Next winter might kill her." Ingrid listened to these assessments and said nothing. She thanked neighbors for their help and returned to her work. But something had changed inside her during those hours of darkness and cold. Ingrid began paying attention to how other families managed winter firewood. She had always handled it the same way Eric had, the same way everyone handled it. Cut wood in summer and autumn, split it, stack it outside near the cabin, retrieve it as needed through winter. The system was universal because it was obvious and practical. But now she noticed the problems embedded in that universal system, problems everyone accepted as inevitable rather than solvable. She noticed that the Bergstroms kept their woodpile against the north wall of their cabin where snow drifted deepest. During heavy storms, Lars had to dig through accumulated snow to reach his fuel supply. She watched him one afternoon in late January, wielding a shovel for 15 minutes before he could access wood. The effort required was substantial, and the exposure to cold was dangerous. The Johnsons kept their pile in an open area away from the cabin to reduce fire risk. Sensible for safety, but it meant every trip for firewood was a journey of 30 yards through whatever weather was happening. Ingrid watched Helga make that trip during a February snowstorm, struggling against wind with her arms full of wood, nearly losing her footing on ice. The Mackinens, skilled as they were with forestry, stored enormous quantities of wood but left it uncovered. They seemed to believe that wood seasoned better with exposure to air and weather. This was partly true, but Ingrid observed that the outer layers of their stacks were often wet from rain or coated with snow that melted and soaked into the wood when temperatures fluctuated. She began asking questions carefully, not wanting to seem critical. How often did their fires fail to catch properly? How much time did they spend each winter dealing with wet wood that smoked more than it burned? Had they ever faced situations where accessing firewood became dangerous? The responses were variations of the same theme. Yes, wet wood was frustrating. Yes, storms made retrieval difficult. Yes, there were moments of genuine danger, but what could be done? Wood had to be stored outside. Weather was unpredictable. These were simply facts of winter survival. Ingrid wondered why these had to be facts. Why was outdoor storage inevitable? Why did everyone accept that winter fuel access would occasionally become life-threatening? The near-death experience in her cabin had stripped away her acceptance of normal practices. She found herself unable to return to the assumption that things were done a certain way, because that was how they had always been done. She thought about Eric's death. A tree had fallen unpredictably. He had died because he stood in the wrong place at the wrong moment. There had been no preventing that specific accident, but her near death in the blizzard was different. It was entirely predictable. Storms buried wood piles. That was known. Wet wood failed to burn adequately. That was known. So why did everyone continue using systems that guaranteed these problems? Ingrid owned an almanac from 1879 that Eric had purchased their first year on the claim. It contained weather predictions, planting schedules, astronomical tables, and advice on livestock management. The margins of most pages were blank, space intended for farmers to record their own observations. Eric had made occasional notes about frost dates and crop yields. After his death, the almanac had sat unused on a shelf. In late February of 1882, Ingrid retrieved the almanac and began using those blank margins for a different purpose. She started sketching structures. Her drawings were crude, not the work of someone trained in technical illustration, but they communicated ideas clearly enough for her own reference. She drew her cabin from above, a simple rectangle with the door and windows marked. Then she drew a larger rectangle around it. The concept was straightforward. If her cabin sat inside a larger structure, that larger structure could serve multiple functions simultaneously. It would protect the cabin from direct wind and weather. It would create space for storing firewood under cover. It would provide a sheltered area where she could work regardless of outdoor conditions. The outer structure would be simple, basically a large shed with a roof and partial walls. She spent evenings refining the idea. How large should the outer structure be? It needed enough clearance that the cabin's roof would not touch the shed's roof. allowing for snow accumulation on both. It needed enough interior space to store a full winter's firewood supply, which she estimated at 4 cords minimum. A cord of stacked firewood occupied roughly 128 cubic feet. 4 cords would require over 500 cubic feet of storage space, not accounting for air gaps between stacks. She sketched different configurations. The shed could extend 15 feet from the cabin on 2 sides, creating an L-shaped covered area. Or it could surround the cabin on 3 sides, leaving only the door side open. Or it could be a complete enclosure with openings for access. Each option had advantages and complications. Ingrid had no formal education in building or engineering. She had learned basic carpentry from watching Eric and her father before him. She understood how to measure, cut, and join wood. She knew that roofs needed pitch for water drainage, and that posts needed to be set firmly to support weight. Beyond these basics, she was improvising. She began making calculations in the margins next to her sketches. The shed would need corner posts, ridge poles for the roof, and rafters to support roofing material. If she used posts set every 8 feet around the perimeter, she could span the distances with poles harvested from straight pines on the property. She would need approximately 12 posts if she built a 3-sided enclosure. She would need 20 or more rafters depending on the roof span. The material requirements were substantial, but not impossible. She had timber on her claim. She had basic tools. She had time. Spring and summer would provide months of working weather before the next winter arrived. The question was not whether she could physically build what she was sketching. The question was whether she should attempt something this ambitious when neighbors already questioned her judgment. She kept sketching anyway. By early March, she had filled 12 pages of the almanac with drawings, notes, and calculations. The design was becoming clearer. She could see it in her mind now, not just as lines on paper, but as an actual structure she could walk through. The town of Millwood sat 9 miles from Ingrid's homestead, a journey of 2 hours by wagon when roads were passable. The town consisted of one main street with a general store, a hardware store, a grain elevator, a church, and a scattering of houses. Most settlers visited once or twice a month to purchase supplies, sell produce, and collect mail. Ingrid made the trip on a mild afternoon in late March. Snow still covered the ground in patches, but the roads had thawed enough for wagon travel. She left Anders in charge of the homestead and took Karen with her for company. The list of needed supplies was longer than usual. She needed nails, hinges, rope, and a new cross-cut saw blade. She also needed to order lumber for parts of the structure she could not harvest from her own timber. The hardware store was owned by a man named Thomas Crawford, an Englishman who had operated the business for 15 years. He was knowledgeable about construction and often gave advice to settlers building barns or expanding their homes. When Ingrid presented her list, Crawford read it carefully, then looked up with obvious curiosity. "This is quite a bit of hardware for spring work," he said. "What are you building?" Ingrid had anticipated the question. She could have deflected with vague answers, but she saw no reason to hide her intentions. "I am building a shed structure around my cabin," she said, "for firewood storage and weather protection." Crawford's eyebrows rose slightly. "Around your cabin? Not next to it, but around it?" "Yes, the cabin will sit inside the shed. The shed will be larger with space for stacked wood and workspace." Crawford set down the list and leaned against the counter. "That is an unusual design. I have not seen anything quite like that. What made you think of it?" "The blizzard in January nearly killed me because I could not access my woodpile," Ingrid said. "I do not intend to face that situation again." Crawford nodded slowly. He did not mock the idea, but his expression showed uncertainty. "It will require substantial materials. The cost will be significant, and the labor will be considerable for one person working alone. I have timber on my property for posts and poles. I need hardware and some dimensional lumber. I cannot mill myself. I can manage the labor." Crawford wrote out a cost estimate for the materials Ingrid requested. The total was more than she wanted to spend, but it was within the limits of money she had saved from selling eggs and preserved goods over the winter. She authorized the order. Crawford said the lumber would arrive by rail within 2 weeks, and she could collect it then. As Ingrid and Karen left the store, she saw Crawford speaking with another customer, gesturing toward her and shaking his head slightly. Word would spread quickly. By the time she returned to collect her lumber, half the town would know about the widow Halverson's strange building project. She accepted this as inevitable. People talked. Their opinions meant nothing compared to her need to survive the next winter. The first neighbor to comment directly was Lars Bergstrom. He stopped by the homestead in early April, ostensibly to return a tool Eric had lent him years before. But his real purpose became clear when he saw Ingrid measuring distances from her cabin and marking positions with stakes. "Helga mentioned you were planning some building work," Lars said, watching as Ingrid stretched a measuring cord from one stake to another. "What exactly are you constructing?" Ingrid explained the plan. A shed structure enclosing the cabin on 3 sides, covered firewood storage, protected workspace. Lars listened without interrupting, then stood silent for a moment before speaking. "That is a great deal of work for one person, and the cost of materials must be significant. Have you considered a simpler approach? A small woodshed built next to the cabin would be faster and cheaper." "A woodshed next to the cabin would require me to go outside to retrieve wood during storms. My design eliminates that problem." Lars frowned slightly, but the effort involved. "Ingrid, you have a farm to maintain, children to care for, and limited time. Building something this complex could take all summer. Is it worth the investment?" "It is worth not freezing to death," Ingrid said. She did not mean to sound sharp, but she was tired of explaining herself. Lars left shortly after, polite but clearly unconvinced. 2 days later, Carl Johnson visited. He brought his blacksmith's expertise and offered to examine Ingrid's plans. She showed him her sketches. He studied them carefully, then pointed out potential structural problems. The roof span was ambitious. The posts would need to be very secure. Had she considered snow load on the shed roof in addition to the cabin roof beneath it? Ingrid had considered these things. She explained her calculations. Carl nodded but remained skeptical. "It might work," he said. "But if it fails, you will have wasted months of labor and significant money. A traditional woodshed would be safer." The word spread through the scattered community with surprising speed. Within 2 weeks, Ingrid's project had become a topic of conversation among all the nearby families. Most of the commentary was skeptical. Some was openly mocking. The phrase "Ingrid's foolish fortress" began circulating, spoken with amusement rather than malice, but dismissive nonetheless. When Ingrid went to town to collect her lumber order, she overheard 2 men talking outside the grain elevator. "The Halverson widow is building a barn around her cabin," one said. "Can you imagine? As if the cabin itself was not enough shelter." "She should sell and move to town," the other replied. "A woman has no business trying to prove up a claim alone. She will bankrupt herself on nonsense projects." Ingrid loaded her lumber and drove home without acknowledging the conversation. She had expected doubt. She had not expected it to sting quite as much as it did. But the sting did not change her determination. They could mock all they wanted. She would build what she needed to survive. Ingrid began construction on April 22, 1882. The ground had thawed enough to dig post holes, though frost still lingered 18 inches down in shaded areas. She started with the corners, marking positions that would create a structure extending 14 feet from the cabin's walls on the north, east, and west sides. The south side, where the cabin door faced, would remain open for access. She dug the first post hole using a spade and a long iron bar for breaking through hard soil. The hole needed to be 3 feet deep to get below the frost line and prevent posts from shifting during freeze-thaw cycles. Each hole took nearly 2 hours to dig. She worked methodically, removing soil in stages, widening the hole as she went deeper. The posts themselves came from white pine trees she had marked the previous month. She selected trees that were straight, roughly 10 inches in diameter, and free of significant rot or insect damage. Anders helped her fell the trees using a crosscut saw, a task that took most of a day for each tree. They limbed the fallen trunks and cut them to 12-foot lengths. Ingrid stripped the bark using a draw knife, working in the evenings after daily farm tasks were finished. Setting the posts required precision. Each post had to be vertical and positioned exactly according to her measurements. Ingrid used a plumb line, a simple tool consisting of a weight on a string, to check that posts stood truly upright. She would set a post in its hole, check it with the plumb line, adjust the angle, then pack rocks and soil around the base to hold it in position. Once she was satisfied with the placement, she tamped the soil firmly using a heavy wooden pole. The work was physically exhausting. Ingrid's hands developed new calluses. Her back ached from bending and lifting, but she maintained steady progress. By early May, she had set 8 corner posts and 4 intermediate posts along the longer walls. The posts formed a rough rectangle around her cabin with enough clearance that she could walk between the cabin walls and the post line. Next came the horizontal beams that would connect the posts and support the roof structure. She used straight pine poles roughly 6 inches in diameter, notched to fit over the posts. Anders helped her lift these beams into position, a task that required coordination and strength. They worked together, raising one end of a beam, propping it temporarily, then raising the other end until it rested on its intended post. Ingrid secured the beams by drilling holes through both the beam and the post, then driving wooden pegs through the holes. The pegs were made from dried oak, harder than the pine they penetrated, and they locked the joints solidly. She also used iron nails where stress would be greatest, reinforcing connections that would bear significant roof weight. By the end of May, the basic frame stood complete. 12 posts connected by horizontal beams created a skeleton structure around the cabin. It looked strange and unfinished, but the bones were sound. The roof presented the most complex engineering challenge. Ingrid needed to build a structure that would span the 14-foot distance from the cabin walls to the outer posts, support heavy snow loads through winter, and provide enough clearance that snow accumulating on the cabin's existing roof would not contact the shed roof above it. She decided on a simple gable design that would match the cabin's roof pitch. Water and snow would shed efficiently, and the construction would use techniques she understood. The challenge was the span distance and the need to support weight at multiple points. She started by installing ridge poles that ran parallel to the cabin's walls, resting on the horizontal beams she had already secured to the posts. These ridge poles were 8 inches in diameter, substantial enough to carry the load of rafters and roofing materials. She notched them to sit securely on the beams and spiked them in place with long iron nails. The rafters came next. Ingrid cut these from straight pine poles roughly 4 inches in diameter. Each rafter needed to be precisely measured and cut so that it would rest at the correct angle, creating the roof pitch she wanted. She made a pattern rafter first, testing the fit before cutting the remaining pieces. Once she was satisfied with the pattern, she used it as a template for marking and cutting 24 more rafters. Installing the rafters required patience and often a second set of hands. Anders helped when he could, but much of the time Ingrid worked alone. She would position a rafter, check its placement, then secure it by driving nails at an angle through the rafter into the ridge pole. The work required her to climb repeatedly, using a ladder she had built from scrap lumber specifically for this project. The roof structure took shape slowly. After 2 weeks, half the rafters were installed. After 3 weeks, the complete framework was in place. Ingrid stood back and examined the skeleton of poles and rafters above her cabin. It looked fragile from a distance, but she had tested each connection and knew the structure was sound. Over the rafters, she laid split planks that she and Anders had prepared by riving pine logs with wedges and a maul. The planks were rough but serviceable. She laid them across the rafters with slight overlaps, creating a base for the final roofing material. She secured each plank with nails, working from the eaves upward toward the ridge. For the final waterproof layer, she used birch bark harvested from dead trees on the property. Birch bark was naturally water-resistant and flexible. She laid it in overlapping strips like shingles, starting at the bottom edge of the roof and working upward. Each strip overlapped the one below it by several inches. She secured the bark with small wooden pegs and occasional nails where needed. The completed roof extended well beyond the cabin's existing roofline, creating a protective umbrella. Rain falling on the shed roof would run off onto the ground beyond the posts, leaving the interior space dry. Ingrid did not want solid walls enclosing the entire structure. Full walls would trap moisture and prevent the air circulation necessary to keep stored firewood dry, but she needed some barrier against wind and drifting snow. Her solution was partial walls that would block weather from the prevailing directions while leaving gaps for airflow. She started by observing wind patterns around the homestead. The strongest winds came from the northwest during winter storms. Snow drifted most severely on the north and west sides of buildings. The east side received less direct wind, and the south side, which she was leaving open for access, would need no additional protection. On the north side, she built a solid wall from the ground to roughly 5 feet high, leaving the upper portion open to the roof. She used vertical planks nailed to horizontal rails that spanned between posts. The planks were cut from logs she and Anders had sawn using a pit saw, a laborious process that produced rough lumber adequate for wall construction. The gaps between planks were minimal but not completely sealed, allowing some air movement while blocking most wind. The west wall received similar treatment, though she left several larger gaps at intervals, creating openings roughly 2 feet wide. These gaps would allow cross-ventilation while still providing substantial wind protection. She reasoned that air needed to circulate to prevent moisture accumulation, but the circulation could be controlled rather than completely unrestricted. The east wall was built with wider spacing between planks, essentially creating a slatted barrier rather than a solid surface. Wind from the east was less common and less severe, so heavy protection was unnecessary. The slatted design would prevent direct snow entry while maximizing airflow. All the wall sections stopped several feet short of the roof, leaving an open band around the entire structure's perimeter. This ensured that even with partial walls, the interior would never become stagnant or trap moisture that could damage stored wood or encourage rot in the structure itself. Ingrid also built a proper door frame in the south-facing opening. She used heavier timbers for the frame posts and header, creating a sturdy opening 8 feet wide. She did not install a door immediately, reasoning that she could add one later if needed. For now, the open access made moving materials and firewood easier. The window openings in the cabin walls now sat well back from the shed's outer perimeter, protected from direct weather by the roof overhang and partial walls. This meant that even during heavy storms, rain and snow would not strike the cabin's windows directly. The additional protection would reduce heat loss and prevent the ice buildup that had plagued the windows during the previous winter. By late June, the walls were complete. The structure had taken shape into something recognizable and functional. Neighbors who passed by and saw the progress stopped commenting openly. The mockery had not disappeared, but it had grown quieter. With the structure complete, Ingrid turned her attention to the system for storing firewood within the protected space. She had 14 feet of depth on 3 sides of the cabin, creating a U-shaped area totaling roughly 800 square feet. This space needed to hold 4 cords of wood minimum, organized for easy access throughout winter. She decided against simply piling wood randomly in the available space. Random stacking wasted room and made retrieval difficult. Instead, she planned rows with specific purposes. The wood closest to the cabin door would be the most accessible, designated for daily use during the coldest months. Wood further from the door could be accessed less frequently, as supplies in the prime location were depleted. Ingrid built raised platforms using small logs as runners, with planks laid across them. The platforms lifted firewood 6 inches off the ground, allowing air circulation underneath and preventing bottom layers from absorbing moisture from the earth. She constructed 3 platforms, each running the length of one wall section. The platforms were simple but sturdy, capable of supporting the substantial weight of stacked cord wood. She established a stacking pattern based on wood size and intended use. Larger split pieces, which would burn longer and produce more heat, went into the row nearest the cabin door. Medium pieces filled the next row. Smaller pieces and kindling occupied the row furthest from easy access. This organization meant she would never waste time searching for the right size wood during cold weather or storms. Between each row, Ingrid left a walking path roughly 2 feet wide. The paths allowed her to access any section of the wood supply without climbing over stacks or disturbing carefully arranged piles. The paths also provided space for air circulation, which was critical for maintaining dry wood. Moisture was the enemy of efficient burning. Any wood that absorbed humidity from trapped air would produce less heat and more smoke. Anders helped with the actual splitting and stacking work. They spent July and August cutting dead, standing trees, hauling logs back to the homestead, splitting them into burnable pieces, and stacking the split wood on the platforms. The work was repetitive and physically demanding. Each cord represented roughly 128 cubic feet of stacked wood, which meant splitting hundreds of individual pieces. Ingrid taught Anders the proper technique for reading wood grain and placing the splitting maul to maximize efficiency. Oak split differently than pine. Wood with knots required different approaches than straight-grained pieces. These were skills Eric had possessed, and Ingrid passed them to her son with the same patience Eric had shown her years earlier. By early September, they had split and stacked 4.5 cords. The rows looked substantial, proof of summer labor now stored safely under roof. Ingrid walked through the interior space, examining what she had built. The cabin sat protected inside its larger shell. Firewood surrounded her on 3 sides, organized and accessible. The roof overhead showed no leaks from the late summer rains that had tested it. The partial walls blocked wind, but allowed airflow. The system was complete and ready for winter. Ingrid spent October on finishing details that would improve function and durability. She built a small workbench along the east wall where she could perform tasks like sharpening tools or repairing equipment without leaving the sheltered space. The bench was simple, just planks mounted on brackets attached to 2 posts, but it provided a solid surface at a bouquet, comfortable working height. She also built storage shelves mounted high on the posts, well above where stacked firewood reached. These shelves held items she needed accessible but protected from weather. Extra axe handles, coils of rope, leather harness pieces, tools that would rust if left exposed to moisture. The shelves made use of vertical space that would otherwise be wasted. The floor inside the shed structure was simply packed earth, which Ingrid leveled and tamped firm. She had considered laying planks to create a proper floor but decided against it. Planks would trap moisture underneath and eventually rot. Packed earth would remain stable and allowed any water that did enter to drain naturally into the soil. She addressed a few structural issues she had noticed during construction. One post had shifted slightly during the summer as the ground settled. She excavated around its base, reset it to proper vertical alignment, and repacked the hole with rocks and soil more carefully than before. 2 rafters showed minor splitting at their ends where nails had been driven. She reinforced these with additional nails driven at different angles. The birch bark roofing had developed a few small gaps where pieces had curled as they dried. Ingrid patched these with fresh bark strips, ensuring the overlapping pattern remained intact. She tested the roof's waterproofing during a heavy rain in mid-October, walking through the interior during the storm to check for drips. She found 3 minor leaks and marked their locations. After the rain stopped, she went up on the roof and sealed the problem areas with additional bark layers. She built a simple tool rack near the entrance where she could hang saws, axes, and splitting mauls. Having tools organized and immediately accessible would save time during winter when efficiency mattered. The rack was just wooden pegs driven into a horizontal board, but it served its purpose. By late October, the first hard frosts arrived. Ingrid examined her work with a critical eye, looking for any weaknesses or oversights. She found none that concerned her. The structure was solid. The firewood was dry and well organized. The interior space was functional and protected. She had accomplished what she set out to build. The homestead looked different now. The cabin, which had stood alone and exposed for 3 years, sat nestled inside its protective shell. The visual change was striking. Neighbors passing on the road would slow and stare at the unusual configuration. Some still shook their heads at the apparent excess. Others studied it with increasing interest, though few would admit publicly that the design had merit. Ingrid felt satisfaction but remained cautious. The true test would come when winter arrived in full. The structure was built. Now it needed to prove itself. Snow arrived on November 7th. The storm was not severe by winter standards, just a steady snowfall that accumulated 6 inches over the course of a day and night, but it was enough for Ingrid to test her system under real conditions. She woke before dawn, as she always did, started a fire in the cabin stove using kindling from inside, then prepared to retrieve wood for the day's fuel needs. Normally, this task would require her to dress for outdoor weather, open the cabin door into whatever conditions existed outside, and make multiple trips to an exposed wood pile. This morning was different. Ingrid opened her cabin door and stepped into the shed's interior. The temperature inside the shed was cold, not much warmer than outside, but she was completely protected from falling snow. She walked to the nearest row of stacked wood, selected pieces of the size she wanted, and carried them back to the cabin. The entire process took 3 minutes and required no exposure to weather. She made 2 more trips, gathering enough wood to last through the day and into evening. Each trip was effortless compared to what the task had been the previous winter. Later that morning, she stood in the shed's entrance and watched snow continue falling. The interior space remained completely dry. Snow accumulated on the shed's roof, but nothing entered the protected area. The partial walls blocked wind-driven snow from entering through the sides. The open upper sections allowed air circulation, but were positioned high enough that snow could not blow in horizontally. The design was working exactly as she had intended. Karen came out from the cabin and stood beside her mother, looking at the falling snow from their dry shelter. "It is strange to stand here and watch the storm without being in it," the girl said. Ingrid nodded. It was strange. It was also exactly what she had worked all summer to achieve: protection without confinement, access without exposure, the ability to manage essential tasks regardless of weather conditions. Over the following days, as the snow continued intermittently, Ingrid refined her understanding of the system's advantages. The shed's roof shed snow efficiently, preventing dangerous buildup. The wood stacks remained completely dry because the roof overhang extended well beyond the stacked rows. She could split additional wood inside the sheltered space during snowfall, something impossible when working in the open. The workbench she had built proved useful for tasks she had previously postponed during bad weather. Anders commented that feeding the livestock was now the most unpleasant outdoor task because it required leaving the protected area and walking to the barn through snow. Everything else they needed to do could be accomplished while remaining sheltered. This realization highlighted how comprehensive the shed's protection was. Their entire daily routine had become weather-independent except for animal care. By late November, word had spread through the community that Ingrid's structure was performing well. No one said this directly to her, but she sensed the shift in attitude. When neighbors visited, The mockery had stopped. Questions began replacing skepticism. December brought temperatures that dropped below zero and stayed there for days at a time. The cold was severe enough that exposed skin would frost within minutes. Most settlers minimized outdoor activity, venturing out only for essential tasks like feeding livestock or retrieving firewood. The difference in Ingrid's situation became increasingly obvious. The Bergstroms, 2 miles away, maintained their woodpile against the north wall of their cabin, where drifting snow created ongoing access problems. Lars spent time each day digging out his wood supply. The effort was necessary but exhausting, and the physical exertion in extreme cold carried risks. Astrid Bergstrom worried constantly about Lars overexerting himself in dangerous temperatures. The Johnsons kept their woodpile in an open area, which meant every trip for fuel required 30 yards of travel through bitter cold. Helga Johnson told Ingrid at church one Sunday that she dreaded the wood retrieval task, especially on the coldest mornings when the walk felt dangerous. Their youngest child had developed frostbite on his fingers after helping carry wood one particularly cold afternoon. The Finnish family, skilled and well-prepared as they were, dealt with moisture problems in their uncovered wood stacks. The outer layers of their carefully stacked cords had absorbed snow and ice during fluctuating temperatures. When they burned this compromised wood, it produced excessive smoke and reduced heat output. They had adequate fuel, but not optimal fuel. Ingrid's system eliminated all these problems. Her wood remained bone dry. Access required no outdoor exposure. She could retrieve fuel while wearing indoor clothing, making multiple trips if needed without discomfort or danger. The contrast between her situation and her neighbors became impossible to ignore. On December 19th, temperatures fell to 18 below zero. The cold was life-threatening to anyone who spent extended time outdoors. Most families stayed inside except for absolutely critical tasks. Ingrid maintained her normal routine. She fed her livestock quickly, the only task requiring outdoor exposure, then returned to the shed's protection. She spent the afternoon splitting wood under shelter, preparing fuel for the weeks ahead. The work kept her warm through physical activity, and the shed blocked wind that would have made outdoor work impossible. Carl Johnson stopped by 2 days later, ostensibly delivering a tool he had repaired in his smithy, but he spent 20 minutes examining Ingrid's shed structure, asking detailed questions about construction methods and material costs. He did not apologize for his earlier skepticism, but his interest made his changed opinion obvious. "This space stays dry even during blowing snow?" he asked. "Completely dry," Ingrid said. "The roof overhang and partial walls block everything." Carl nodded, slowly studying the roof structure. "And you built this working mostly alone?" Anders helped with heavy lifting. "But yes, mostly alone. It must have taken considerable time. 3 months of steady work, but it will serve me for 20 years or more. The investment was worthwhile." Carl left without further comment, but Ingrid knew what the visit meant. He was evaluating whether to build something similar for his own family. The mockery was gone. Practical interest had replaced it. The blizzard arrived on January 14, 1883, almost exactly 1 year after the storm that had nearly killed Ingrid. Weather patterns had a way of repeating in the northern territories, bringing the season's worst conditions at predictable intervals. This storm proved even more severe than the previous year's crisis. The snow began at dawn with moderate intensity. By mid-morning, the wind had increased to the point that visibility dropped to a few yards. By afternoon, the storm reached full blizzard conditions. Snow fell so heavily that Ingrid could not see the tree line at the edge of her clearing. Wind created drifts that grew visibly higher with each passing hour. The temperature dropped to 15 below zero. The storm continued through the night without weakening. By the morning of the second day, snow had accumulated over 2 feet on level ground and much deeper wherever drifting occurred. The wind remained fierce, driving snow horizontally and making any outdoor movement dangerous. Still, the storm continued. Ingrid maintained the cabin's fire without difficulty. She made regular trips into the shed's interior to retrieve wood, walking through the protected space while the blizzard raged a few feet away on the other side of the partial walls. The sensation was surreal. She could hear the wind roaring, see snow blowing past the shed's openings, but she remained completely dry and suffered no exposure to the storm's force. Anders and Karen watched through the cabin's windows as the world outside disappeared into white chaos. They were safe and warm. The fire burned steadily. The wood supply was abundant and accessible. This storm, which would have been life-threatening the previous year, was merely weather happening outside their protected space. The storm continued into the third day. This was unusual. Most blizzards exhausted themselves within 48 hours. This one maintained its intensity, dumping snow and driving wind without pause. Drifts reached the rooflines of buildings throughout the region. Settlers who ventured outside reported visibility so poor they could not see their own hands extended at arm's length. On the fourth day, the storm finally began weakening. The snow tapered to light flurries by afternoon and stopped completely by evening. The silence after 4 days of constant wind was striking. Ingrid opened the cabin door and stepped into the shed. Snow had drifted against the partial walls, reaching nearly to their 5-foot height on the north side. But inside the protected space, the ground showed only a light dusting from snow that had blown through the upper openings and settled gently to earth. The wood stacks were untouched. The interior was dry. She walked to the shed's entrance and looked out at the transformed landscape. Drifts had completely reshaped the terrain. The path to the barn was buried. The forest edge had disappeared behind accumulated snow. The cold remained brutal, and digging out from this storm would require days of hard work. But Ingrid had maintained heat throughout the crisis without struggling for fuel access. She had never faced danger from exposure. Her children had remained safe and warm. Astrid Bergstrom arrived at the homestead 6 days after the blizzard ended. She came alone, walking the 2 miles on snowshoes because the roads remained impassable to wagons. Ingrid saw her approaching and went to meet her at the edge of the clearing. Astrid looked exhausted. "I needed to see how you managed during the storm," Astrid said without preamble. "We struggled. Lars nearly exhausted himself keeping the fire fed. Our woodpile was buried so deeply he could barely reach it. I was frightened for him." Ingrid led Astrid into the shed's interior. The contrast with outdoor conditions was immediately apparent. Astrid stopped and looked around at the protected space, the organized wood stacks, the dry ground, the substantial roof overhead. She walked slowly through the area, examining details with careful attention. "This is what you built last summer," Astrid said. "The structure everyone thought was excessive." "Yes, it works. It works very well." Astrid was quiet for a moment, still looking at the construction. When she spoke again, her voice was softer. "I need to understand how you built this. Lars is a good man, but he is proud. He will not ask you himself, but I can see that we need something like this. This winter has been too hard." Ingrid spent the next hour explaining the construction process in detail. She showed Astrid how the posts were set, how the beams connected, how the roof was framed and covered. She explained her reasoning for partial walls rather than full enclosure. She discussed the wood stacking system and why air circulation mattered for keeping fuel dry. Astrid listened intently, occasionally asking questions that showed she understood the principles involved. "The cost?" Astrid asked. "We do not have much money available. Most of the materials came from our own timber. I purchased nails, some hardware, and dimensional lumber I could not mill myself. The total cost was approximately $35. The labor was substantial, but labor costs nothing if you do it yourself." "How long did construction take?" 3 months working steadily. Lars is stronger than I am and has older sons to help. He could likely complete it faster." Astrid nodded. He will want to start this spring. May I bring him to see this and ask more questions? Of course. Anyone who wants to see it is welcome. Astrid left an hour later, walking back through the snow with visible determination. Ingrid watched her go and felt a quiet satisfaction. She had not built the shed seeking validation or hoping to change anyone's mind. She had built it to survive. But if others could learn from her work and improve their own situations, that was acceptable. Lars Bergstrom visited 3 weeks after Astrid's initial trip. He came with his 2 oldest sons and spent an entire afternoon examining Ingrid's structure. He measured post spacing, studied the roof framing, and asked technical questions about bearing loads and material selection. Ingrid answered everything honestly. She had no interest in keeping secrets about construction methods that could help families survive. By late March, Lars had begun building his own version on his property. His design differed in details but followed the same basic principles. He built a 4-sided enclosure rather than Ingrid's 3-sided approach, fully surrounding his cabin. He used heavier timbers because he had access to larger trees. But the core concept remained identical, a protective shed around the cabin with integrated firewood storage and weather protection. Carl Johnson started his construction in April. His blacksmith skills allowed him to fabricate custom iron brackets and hinges that made his structure more refined than Ingrid's utilitarian approach. He added a proper door to the shed's entrance and built more elaborate storage systems inside. But again, the fundamental idea came directly from what Ingrid had proven worked. The Finnish family, who had always been skilled builders, created their own variation that summer. They incorporated a separate workshop area within the shed structure, dedicating space not just to firewood, but to their lumber processing operation. Their design was the most ambitious, essentially creating a small industrial space that happened to surround their cabin. Other families in the wider area heard about the concept through the informal networks that connected frontier communities. A trapper who passed through the region and spent a night at the Bergstrom's place saw their shed cabin and took the idea 20 miles north, where he built his own version. A family moving west from Michigan stopped at Carl Johnson's homestead and asked detailed questions about the strange building arrangement they observed. By 1885, variations of the shed cabin design existed throughout a 30-mile radius of Ingrid's original homestead. No 2 were identical. Each family adapted the concept to their specific needs, available materials, and building skills. Some were crude and simple. Others showed sophisticated carpentry, but they all solved the same fundamental problem: protecting inhabitants and their fuel supply from winter weather. Nobody called it Ingrid's design. The few times she heard people discussing the structures, they were referred to as covered cabins or weather sheds or simply that barn-style building approach. This did not bother her. She had never wanted credit or recognition. She had wanted to survive, and she had found a way to do so that happened to work for others as well. The practical benefits extended beyond just firewood access. Families discovered that the shed structures provided space for winter tasks that would otherwise be impossible during harsh weather. Women could do laundry under cover. Men could repair equipment without working in the cold. Children had protected play areas during storms. The structures improved quality of life in ways Ingrid had not anticipated, but quickly became valued by everyone who built them. By the late 1880s, the design had become common enough that new settlers arriving in the region sometimes asked specifically about building covered cabins, having heard they were standard practice in Northern Territories. Ingrid Halvorsen completed her homestead claim in 1884, 5 years after Eric had filed it. She received the land patent, making her the legal owner of 160 acres. She continued living on the property, raising her children, maintaining the farm, and surviving each winter in the shelter she had built. Anders grew to adulthood and eventually homesteaded his own claim 8 miles west of his mother's land. He built a shed cabin structure for his own family, teaching his wife the same principles Ingrid had taught him. Karen married a carpenter from town and moved to Millwood, but visited regularly, always bringing her children to see the unusual building where she had grown up. Ingrid lived until 1904, reaching the age of 56. She died peacefully in her cabin surrounded by family. The cause was pneumonia, common among older people during harsh winters, though perhaps less common than it might have been if she had spent decades exposing herself to extreme weather for daily tasks. Her children sold the homestead to a young couple from Iowa in 1905. The new owners were impressed by the shed structure and maintained it carefully. They raised 3 children in the protected cabin and eventually sold to another family in 1922. The structure continued serving occupants for decades. By the 1930s, newer building techniques and materials had made the shed cabin design less necessary. Modern lumber mills provided dimensional boards that allowed for tighter construction. Insulation materials became available that made cabins warmer without external protection. Rural electrification began reaching outlying areas, bringing electric heating options. The old frontier survival methods gradually became obsolete, but some of the original structures remained standing. Ingrid's shed cabin survived into the 1950s before finally being demolished to make room for a modern house on the property. By then, it had sheltered inhabitants for over 70 years, far longer than the 3 to 5 year lifespan of standard frontier cabins from the same era. Historians studying frontier life occasionally encountered references to covered cabin construction in settlers' journals and letters from the late 1800s. The references were usually brief, treating the design as an unremarkable local building practice. Few historians recognize that the practice had originated from a single widow's desperate innovation following a near-death experience. The story of how Ingrid Halverson built a shed around her cabin to solve a winter survival problem was not preserved in any formal records. Her name appeared in homestead documents, census records, and church registries, but nothing identified her as an innovator or noted her contribution to frontier building practices. She had lived quietly, survived, raised her children, and died without seeking recognition. But the buildings remained for a time, physical evidence of an idea born from necessity and proven through harsh experience. They stood as silent testament to the fact that survival on the frontier often depended not on strength or weapons, but on thinking carefully about problems and building solutions that worked. Ingrid had done exactly that, and dozens of families had lived safer, warmer lives because she refused to accept that suffering through winter fuel access was inevitable.